So even moving into fall and winter, there are some vegetables that you can leave in the ground and out in the garden and harvest from without bringing in and preserving them. So this works really well with root crops. Specifically, we're going to be starting with our beets. So beets are a bit frost hardy, but the greens will get damaged once you start to get down into those really cold frosts, and of course if you have snow that is coming on. But when the beet is beneath the ground, it is going to be just fine. And so a lot of people will even overwinter their beets. But we definitely want to do some mulching, because if we don't do mulch and we get those hard freezes, what'll happen is the part of the beetroot that is, you can see I just barely am pulling this back and I've got a nice little beet here. But because this is so close to the surface, I don't actually want the beet to freeze. And so if I don't mulch this, then the actual beet will get froze and then it will thaw and then it'll get really mushy. And we don't want that, because then it's just going to rot and it's not going to be any good. So we want to make sure that we get a nice mulch on these to help protect it from the freezing and the thawing. And then you can leave the beets in the ground. I usually will leave mine in through November, and then I start checking them in December just to make sure that they're not beginning to rot or they're not beginning to get damaged. But this gives me at least another 4 to 6 weeks of having these in the ground, and I don't have to try to have them. We don't have a root cellar, and I don't have to store them in the fridge. So you can use shredded leaves, work great. I don't happen to have any shredded leaves right now. I've got some big ones that have just fallen in, but I don't have enough to do a nice heavy layer of mulch. So I'm going to be mulching these with some straw. So here I've got some straw. I actually used this earlier in the year, so it's kind of breaking down a little bit, but for mulching purposes, it is going to be just fine. So you really want to get sure that you're doing several inches deep. And the beets really aren't going to get much bigger. They're pretty much just going to stay the size that they are once you get this cold. Get some more. So even though we are leaving these in the ground, don't expect them to grow and to become very much bigger. They need to be of harvestable size by the time your mulching in this cold weather has hit. There you go. And I just like to do at least a couple of inches deep, because as it begins to rain more and snow, this will kind of compact down and it won't be quite as light as fluffy as it is right now. But that's going to provide a good protection on the top of those beets there. So the second crop that this works really well with is carrots. And the great thing is when you mulch and do this method with the carrots, I've actually had carrots go clear into January. And that's usually just because that's when I pull the last of them up that I need them. So this works really well, but it's kind of the same thing. You've got your carrot tops here, and the carrots need to be of a decent, harvestable size for the most part before we begin mulching like this as we move into this cold weather. But the good news is with your carrots, and you can go and check out the video I have on seed saving from carrots, even if you don't, the carrots, say you planted them and they just didn't get quite large enough for harvestable size, you can leave them in the ground. And I still go ahead and mulch these, but you can leave them in the ground, and then in the springtime they will send up blossoms, which will then obviously flower and create seeds, and then you can get your carrot seed from them because they're a biennial and they don't usually produce their seeds until the second growing year. So we're just gonna get these nice and mulched. Now these guys are set. Now the third crop that you can do this with is potatoes. So I've got my potatoes over here in the ground, And you can see where this whole line here was our potato crop. And you can see here where we've had our killing frost. We actually had snow yesterday morning. It's already melted, but we've had a lot of cold weather. And so this is the hills that I had the potatoes in. These are the vines that have all since died back. But typically, now this is going to depend on how well draining your soil is. If your soil is really clay or it holds a lot of water, then you probably don't want to use this method. But even though we live in the Pacific Northwest, we do get a lot of rainfall, our soil is very well draining. So I don't have a lot of standing water and I'm not worried about these potatoes rotting. But I've got them down here in the ground. So you can see this one wasn't too far down. So here is one of my potatoes. Right here. So, and I've got more down under here in the soil growing, but I am leaving these out here in the ground right now until I am ready to harvest them. So I will come out every few weeks if I'm not harvesting them, and I will check them just to make sure that they're not beginning to rot. But if you've ever grown potatoes, you know that you usually miss one or two, especially if they're the little ones when you're harvesting them. And then the next spring, when you come back to that area of the garden and you're getting ready to plant something else in there, you will find the potatoes that you missed, and they're just fine. And so based upon that principle, I'm going to be leaving these potatoes in the ground. I will be mulching them just because you saw that one was pretty close to the surface and you don't want them to freeze. So we need to make sure that we're providing, which is why we're mulching all of these root vegetables, including these potatoes, is that we're providing enough protection that as they're close to the surface of the soil, that they're not going to freeze. Because if they do that freeze-thaw cycle, then they're not going to be any good and they're going to be damaged. So you definitely need to know what your temperatures are where you live, how cold the soil temperature gets, and that you're going to be able to insulate them well enough to avoid a ton of frost damage. But we're going to give it a go, and I'm going to leave these in for at least another 4 weeks and then just come out and harvest them as I need be. And we don't typically get feet and feet of snow this time of year, so I know that I'm not going to have to be digging underneath the snow, etc., in order to use these method. This also works really well with a lot of the other root crops, like if you've got, you can do it with rutabaga. Some of those other root crops work really well. But you can also leave vegetables out in the garden and still harvest them in the fall and into the winter months as well, even if they're not root crops. And the ones that have worked the best for us are our Brussels sprouts and our kale plants. So right here is pretty much my forest of Brussels sprouts that I have growing, and some of the stalks have gotten so big they've kind of fallen over a little bit. But you can see at the top of the Brussels sprouts, I've got smaller Brussels sprouts that are still forming, and then we've been harvesting for quite a few weeks now down on the base of the Brussels sprouts. So here, I've got the larger Brussels sprouts, so I'll be harvesting these. The great thing is Brussels sprouts actually are improved flavor-wise when they go through a frost, so they are much sweeter. Like, we don't even bother harvesting our Brussels sprouts, even if they're ready, until they go through a frost if we can help it, because they taste so much better. So I just come out all the way through, usually until January, even into February, as long as we haven't harvested all of them, and we'll continue to harvest the Brussels sprouts, just working our way up from the bottom, the bigger ones first. And it works really great. Like I said, we've had temperatures down, I think we were 23 degrees the other day, and then we've had a snow, which was yesterday, and these will be just fine. They're a little bit muddy because my fingers are dirty, but they'll rinse off and be great. Now, this doesn't work as well it works really well with the Brussels sprouts. I haven't had it work as well with like cauliflower and broccoli. They will survive temperatures down into the 20s, broccoli and cauliflower, but I find that not repetitively, that it does tend to damage them. So this works really well with the Brussels sprouts, and it works really well with the kale. So I've got my kale plants over here, and I think I've got about 4 of them left here. And so these kale plants, they really won't produce a whole lot more new leaves, like you can see here at the top where they've been producing the new leaves. Once we hit these frosts and these cold temps, they don't really produce a lot of new, but what they do have will stay just fine. So I have actually harvested kale out in the garden all the way through until March before I pulled it. And this I planted actually the end of May is when we planted this. And so I've got some bigger ones out over here. that have more leaves on them. These ones I've been harvesting on a little bit more heavily, so don't have quite as much. But I will be able to harvest off of these by doing nothing, just leaving them out in the garden. I don't cover them with any type of sheets. They'll have snow on them. I've had smaller plants be buried in snow. The snow melts and the leaves are just fine. So like I said, our temperatures usually range in the 20s. Sometimes we'll get a few overnight lows sporadically that are down in the teens, but just for a range, we're gardening zone 7 of what our temperatures are like. But I'll be harvesting on this all winter long without doing anything. If you want to know more about growing Brussels sprouts, because I know some people have a lot of trouble with Brussels sprouts, you can check out my video that will tell you all about my best tips for growing Brussels sprouts and getting a harvest off of them. And if you actually want to see me harvesting the Brussels sprouts in 2 feet of snow, you can check out that video as well, and you can see how they held up during a huge snowstorm.